Hello, guys and gals. Me, Mudahar. It's a late night, and I have a simple question. Have we kind of already lost? Is it over? Is it done? Or are we at that end point? Ladies and gentlemen, I have been talking for years now about the direction the internet has taken in terms of how much control the people above us are going to have over us. Back when I started the internet, early 2000s, you could go to any website, browse anything you ever wanted, and generally speaking, it is basically the last real bastion of true human freedom. I mean, think about how beautiful the internet is, right? The ability for anybody around the world to just talk to each other without, any borders, without any governments stopping us. It's a really, really beautiful part of the world, right? It's actually one of the best inventions I think humans have ever made. When you look at the internet itself, there's a lot of places in the world, like China, for instance, like North Korea, that have created their own intranets. Basically, their people are unable to mostly access outside and vice versa. They kind of live in a segregated part of the world. Not to say you can't interact in certain cases, but you can. Now, for the most part, if you lived in Canada, the United States, the UK, Australia, accessing the internet unfettered is something that I think everyone basically took for granted. So, literally today, the actual Prime Minister of the United Kingdom decided to come in and basically, put in an ultimatum, right? In the next 3 months, they want to be able to start scanning your phone. I'm not joking. This is a real situation, and some of the biggest tech companies involved in your privacy have basically started warning people that in the next 3 months, if the government is going to push as hard as they want, basically there's going to be on-device tools, on-device systems that will basically sit there and scan your device for, I guess, anything that they may not be comfortable with. Now, a lot of these functionalities are present in things like iPhones or even in Android devices. I've talked about it, right? Literally in the last few days. And these systems allow a lot of these big tech companies to make sure that obviously children and I guess even adults aren't sending things that are uncouth or, sending things that might be a little bit too saucy, if you will. The government, I feel like, wants to push more and more surveillance, more and more content detection systems, and maybe down to the point where if you're using privacy-focused messaging services like Signal, for instance, maybe before Signal protects your messages, on-device systems will be scanning every single thing that you say or send. And they literally do say, Signal says, the safeguards claiming the technology would operate solely on device do not eliminate the broader privacy risks. The organization, Signal, contends that future governments could expand the scope of content detection systems to monitor additional categories of material beyond nudity. Remember, when we were talking about like all these age verifications and these sites, banning people from access, it started with adult websites, right? The easiest shit to justify banning from children. And now it's expanded to social media. And who knows where it expands even further. So to go back and keep things on track, ladies and gentlemen, obviously in Monday, today, literally tomorrow, or basically today, the UK will basically announce that they're going to be following Australia's example on banning and, basically preventing people under the age of 16 to access most of the popular social media services out there. Now, if you've been following anything in Australia, and I have, basically, you can get an idea of how their bans are effectively working. So basically, in Australia, if you want to talk about age-restricted social media platforms, Facebook, Instagram, Kik, Reddit, Snapchat, Threads, TikTok, Twitch, X, I love how they dead name it by Twitter all the time, and then YouTube. Now, a lot of these, all these social media platforms are not like each other. YouTube has a lot of good resources for children to access when it comes to education, and God knows what else. You can make an argument that maybe things like TikTok, X, Twitch, Threads, Snapchat are probably bad things. But ultimately, a lot of children these days get their information, a lot of teenagers, a lot of people, even adults, get most of their information, I would say, through social media feeds. As harrowing as that sounds, the reality of it is that this is how people consume the world around them. This is how people get access to shit around them. This is how people learn about the world. And the reality of it is ever since this stuff has been banned, there's actually been studies done by, again, universities, educational groups, that show that almost 2 in 5 people that are Australians don't use any formal sources of news. They don't watch TV, they don't like stick around with the old traditional media. They're not old heads. Basically, at this point, for many young people, blocking their social media access doesn't actually redirect their engagement with the world around them, it basically just ends it. As the ban reaches more young people, as it's intended to, it's gonna get worse. Effectively, the younger population doesn't really have a chance in educating themselves and learning about the world. They're basically just fucking shut out. And I think a lot of these like big governments, a lot of these guys, these old dinosaurs actually kind of enjoy that the younger crowd doesn't actually learn about atrocities around the world, doesn't actually learn about, things that affect them on a day-to-day basis. They don't learn about, real reasons to get angry at their government and ask for change. Instead, they shut them out, they keep their brains completely smooth, and that's sort of the trajectory they want to take. Now to go back to again Australia, which is where this kind of started from, the things that aren't, restricted are platforms like Discord, which is interesting given the amount of crazy shit we've heard about from them. GitHub, obviously, because I don't think code is necessarily touching somebody in their no-no places. Google Classroom, Lego Play, Messenger is an interesting choice, where you're telling me that these kids can't receive fucked up things on a text messaging application. Pinterest, Steam, WhatsApp, YouTube Kids. But interestingly, they also involved Roblox. Now, not to throw Roblox under the bus here specifically, but it's interesting that Roblox wants a whole litany of cases involving children being abused moved out of the courtroom, because guess what? Having that on public record looks pretty bad for a company that wants to appeal to the kiddies and appeal to families around the world. So to give you an idea, just a quick understanding of Roblox, basically if Roblox gets its way in this situation, these families who are involved in these cases may never see their day in courts. The company's terms of use state that by signing up, Roblox subscribers forfeit their ability to pursue lawsuits in open court. Instead, claims are to be resolved in closed-door arbitration by private judges. They basically want to put everything behind the scenes. They don't want everybody to know what's actually going on. They face more than 150 child safety suits in federal court. I mean, that is not only insane, but it's just disgusting to see. At the end of the day, the companies that are even on that slight, friendly list are involved in fucked up shit like this. Now, you might be like, well, since Australia was banning it, maybe it'll be effective in the UK. So I feel like for these videos, it's best to come at you with a whole bunch of facts and as much logic as I can. For instance, in Australia, going by one of their most recent, e-safety announcement, their reports, I wanted to read one key fact that blew my mind away, actually researching for this video. Despite the reduction in account ownership for people under the age of 16, a substantial proportion of children under 16 retained accounts on age-restricted platforms. Of the parents who reported their child had an account on each platform prior to the 10th December ban, around 7 in 10 reported that their kids still had an account on Facebook. 63.6%, Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok. Around 3 in 10 reported that their child no longer had an account. 1 in 2 of these parents reported that their child still had an account on YouTube following the age restrictions. So even when they started banning this kind of stuff, a lot of these children, because children are smart, we were all kids at some point, I'm sure we knew how to bypass these social media bans. And a lot of people have made easy guides to teach you that, listen, if you're in these affected shithole countries that do this, you can absolutely access these media services by going to a VPN provider like Nord, for instance, or really, in my opinion, the best is probably Mulvad, since there's so many ways to purchase a subscription, some of them even privately. Install those VPNs, create an account, connect to a server like in Italy or Poland, or basically anywhere where we don't have social media services restricting you, and then you have access to all these places without any ID requirements. Everything that was once banned is finally accessible. Now look, I'm not here to teach kids how to get access to spooky, scary social media that's probably destroying their brains. Look, I get it. Social media is bad indeed. And in a way, I think that banning it probably might be great for mental health for teenagers. But at the end of the day, I don't think banning is necessarily the play to make. A lot of these kids only get their information, and frankly, it is the way of the world now. Ain't nobody watching fucking TV anymore. A lot of us are accessing places like Reddit, like X, like YouTube to get all of our information from wherever. It allows us to get access to the most recent information, and even if there is a misinfo problem, generally speaking, as long as you get the amalgamation of sources, you'll generally be pretty fine. Social media has done one thing that I think is the reason why a lot of these sites or a lot of these countries are going against it. In recent years, it's allowed us to discuss things like the Epstein files. It's allowed us to talk about war crimes happening around the world in places like Palestine, for instance, where, when I was a kid, I didn't really know much about it, right? Obviously, as an adult who unfortunately has unfettered access to see that unjustifiable war crimes that are happening in the region, right? Not saying that that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that having unfettered access probably not good for your mental health, but at the same time, it allows you to see the real horrors of a situation, so you can then raise awareness to your government leaders to maybe stop funding a terror state, that is doing something as terrible as a genocide on a group of people. But it allows you to also look at things like, again, those Epstein files, like I said, where you can see these fucked up things, people can discuss them, and because they can discuss them, people are easily able to organize over the internet and raise some serious fucking, issues. I think a lot of these, government leaders have found that the freedom of the internet is the one thing that they want to highly limit. So adding in things like age verification, ID verification, facial scanning, all these things are not only designed to keep kids away from this kind of information or the ability to talk about this information or even learn about their world, but a lot of it is also meant to monitor who is making what account where and who ultimately is talking about a situation that the government may not appreciate. Look, when I was a kid, there was an event called 9/11. And when 9/11 happened, the whole world fucking shut the fuck up for a minute. The whole world was like, wow, I can't believe this happened. Planes went into entire towers. Towers fell. It was the day that everyone just shut the fuck up. The world stood silent. I remember back then there was this poster. It was 70 images. It was 70 magazine covers of news covers all over the world, different languages, everything, all about 9/11. Literally, it was a huge event. Now, because of something like 9/11, there were acts like the Patriot Act that were passed. The ability of mass surveilling started all the way back then on the internet. And people have been raising awareness about it, obviously. But the thing about it is we're at a precipice now, where if this stuff comes to pass, and it seems like a lot of these government leaders are so aggressively pushing it. Look, think about the government like this. It's super fucking inefficient. But all of a sudden, every country, the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, every one of these governments has suddenly, this year, basically, decided to get together and say, we need to protect children. And the best way to protect children is just start banning social media. They make it sound so palatable and so good. But then the question has to be asked, how do you enforce such a ban? It sounds utopian until you ask them, how the fuck is this going to work? And the reality of it is that the only way to make these social media bans work is if you decide to, again, verify people by getting their identification, meaning that you provide IDs that have already been leaked out to the world, as we've seen with Discord and Australia. You can have facial verification. You can interact with, third-party vendors like Yoti, like Persona, vendors that have had links to invasive mass surveillance firms, where, you've seen initial seed funding from places like Palantir fed into these people. You are now living in a world where, in order to proceed and access the internet as you need it to, you have to effectively dox yourself to a third party or to your government. Basically, every single account that will ever be made after all these laws are passed will have an individual's identity attached. I think a lot of it has happened because, look, for all the great things that social media does, I think one of the biggest issues is, yes, we do live in a world of misinformation. Yes, we do live in a world where I think there's a lot of people that are trying to destroy governments. I think there's a lot of people that are trying to rile up communities. There's a lot of anonymous people raising an unfair stink, right? And those anonymous people, I think, are kind of the reason why the government wants to effectively dox every single individual, wants to put a face to every single account that is made, so that people, whenever they're posting on the internet, they don't have that joy of anonymity. They literally have to post knowing full well that they can be 100% monitored into who they are. And were you always monitored in the past too? To an extent, yes. But this just makes it completely easy for any government to do it, right? It's never about protecting the kids. It is about pushing mass surveillance and putting a face to every single account that exists. Now, ultimately, what the UK has done is not only that, but they're also pushing for things like curfews. So after 8:30, I guess, kids are not allowed to browse social media feeds. As if, at 8:29 p.m., social media is totally fine and dandy, and after then, it's like, well, kids, you should go to bed, okay? It's over for you. Like, the only similar analog to this is something like China, for instance, where in order to access things like online games, yes, you sometimes have to, actually, use, you have to use, an adult's ID, which is something that can be used to bypass in any part of the world. Look, if you're a kid, kids are always going to find ways to bypass. Age verification, you could grab your elder's ID card and get onto the internet. If you want to bypass facial verification, kids have been doing it using games like Death Stranding 2, Gary's Mod. I'm pretty sure using something like Gemini or a video generation model might be the play in the future, right? These are all things that, again, the government wants to push this onto the people, but they realize that enforcing this is not only going to be difficult, it might also be technologically impossible. So again, going to the under 18 stuff, they want to ban people from things like romantic or sexual AI chatbots. They want to crack down on things like AI-generated nudification. A lot of these actual things that they're talking about are situations that we are making actual keystone attempts to. For instance, AI-generated nudification is one of those situations where in a lot of governments in the world, we are actively pushing for laws in the United States, in places like South Korea, where people that are deepfaking individuals actually are facing real criminal penalties doing something of that nature. When you think about chatbots in this way, yeah, sure, are there some tools that probably should be heavily restricted? Absolutely. But they also mention things like disappearing messages and whatnot. And again, these are issues because, yes, kids who do access social media services could actually interact with somebody that is grooming you. But to get rid of things like encryption, to add backdoors, to get rid of disappearing messages, which, by the way, kids are not the only ones that use this. Politicians, government leaders, journalists, people who live in dangerous locations where their communications are being monitored or have the threat of being uncovered need technologies and tools like this to keep themselves alive. This is the kind of shit that these people are pushing that puts a lot of actual well-meaning good people at real risk. And again, I'm doing this video without any jokes or without any haha laughs or actually fucking getting heated because I want, I don't really want to make this video for the average person watching me. I want this video to stand for the people that don't know any better, for the people that don't understand this kind of technology, all right? The problem is, this stuff sounds so good on paper, but the enforcement mechanism, the way to do this is so privacy threatening that we are actually throwing not just the baby out with the bathwater, we're throwing the entire we're just demolishing the house open so everyone outside can look into every aspect of your life. That's what makes this so bad. And the problem with a lot of this stuff too is look, at the end of the day, there's a lot of people that unironically do support this because they don't know any better, right? If you live in Canada, for instance, right, when the government asks you, do you give a shit about children? You're probably going to say yes. And if they tell you, do you support banning social media? Most people will say yeah, because it sounds good on paper. But nobody then fills in the next question and tells them, well, how are you going to enforce this? And that's the same thing with the United Kingdom. What's going to come tomorrow, or basically today at time of filming, will be probably one of the most insane privacy-busting methods of doing this, right? There is no way to achieve this level of safety the government wants to push onto you without completely destroying your privacy in the process, if that makes any sense. And so, look, at the end of the day, the real cure for this is, as I've always said, monitor your children, right? Be a parent. If you're going to be a parent and you're going to buy devices for your kid, it's time to be there to make sure you're being monitored. Look, when I was a kid going to school, they always told us, "Hey, listen, if you're going to go on the internet, never meet somebody that you talk to online, okay?" That was like the most basic advice we ever got. But also, our parents did monitor. At least my parents did. My dad, we kept the computer in the living room. We kept it in a place where my mom and dad could always look over and see exactly what the fuck we were doing. You know what I mean? So it happened, right? And I don't think I ever even had like a computer of my own that I had in my own room until probably when I was, I don't know, like 16. And that was, and I mean that, not that I had a computer, like I had a computer before then, but a computer that could connect to the internet, right? And like access the world. That's something that I got around the age of 16. And by that point, I was old enough to know better. I was like, at that point, I was old, okay? I wasn't just like a little baby anymore. Really, I think these laws are getting introduced not because they want to keep your kids safe. They basically want you to be monitored on the internet, so everything that you say, everything that you write comes with a caveat that you are worried about making a dissenting opinion, right? You are worried about having somebody knock on your door the next day and ask you, do you have a license for that meme or some other fucking stupid shit. It's a sad day when I don't really hear a lot of influencers kind of talk about this, because I feel like a lot of people online are like, I fucking love free speech, but I never hear you fight for free speech. I know it's a tiring fight. And in some ways, it almost feels like you're losing the fight. But when the only people legally fighting against Ofcom, which is the UK office for handling the enforcement of this bullshit, are the 4chan community support forums and fucking Kiwi Farms, if these are the only two people that are actually legally putting up a lawsuit against Ofcom for the insane fines that are being thrown at them because they choose not to, in a great way to fight against this insane tyranny, that's a sad day when these are the only real people fighting. No other influencers, no other people are really talking about this in a real tangible sense. And it's what's gonna happen is that eventually you're gonna wake up one day, you're gonna be on the internet that's completely controlled and monitored, and you're not going to have that freedom you once abso-fucking-lutely took for granted, right? Now, if you're like a young person, look, if the internet gets banned one day, if 2027 looks like a total shithole for the internet where anything we write is completely 100% monitored, look, for years on my channel, I visited every crevice of the dark web. You know what I mean? Like, I visited every goofy website that you could find. And I'm a huge supporter of the dark web. You can download things like the Tor browser for any of your operating systems, and you can open it up right here. There's great tools on the dark web, like Dread, for instance, where you can connect to an online forum, and you can talk to anybody about anything in the world. You can talk about OPSEC, you can talk about basically anything your heart desires. And not only that, but it is actually one of the best ways to access, any form of social media service, right? So if you want to access things like Instagram, literally you can open up the Tor browser, you can type in Instagram on the DuckDuckGo search, and you can access the internet, or you can access Instagram from this actual browser, especially if you live in a country that doesn't necessarily allow you to access this without giving up your identification, right? Not saying that I'm a huge supporter of using this, by the way, to browse things like YouTube, but accessing YouTube and browsing it through the Tor relay, while it may not be the most enjoyable experience, it will still actually work and will allow you to access things like the comment section and maybe even make an account to some extent without giving up your identification. It may not be the most enjoyable experience, but it is one of those ways you can fight back. Until, of course, the government decides that they want to get rid of all onion access, which that would be its own fucking travesty, right? And again, if you are somebody that values any form of like privacy and like the bypassing of government censorship, it's always great to donate to projects like Tor and give them a little bit of money, because ultimately, at the end of the day, this is not a big tech company. These are people that absolutely will appreciate, even if you throw them the $5, and if you have the money, go all the way up to like maybe 100. And if you really have crazy money, I mean, you can go higher than that. You can even treat this like Patreon and give them like, I don't know, $20 monthly if you can afford it. And that'll go a far way. That'll be very much appreciated by basically any of these hobby projects. Not hobby projects, but basically these sort of like free, almost altruistic projects that basically keep the semblance of basic privacy and basic fights against censorship available on the internet. But anyways, I had these nightly thoughts. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike if you dislike it. I am out.